Deputy Owen Murphy, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Carswell. You had a special position at the time of the crisis because you were a journalist, so you were able to see people speaking and acting publicly, but you also spoke to them privately as well. And you were able to see things like briefings behind the scenes or lobbying activities, and you were probably made aware of them. So my first question is, was there a concern at the time in the run-up to the crisis, either yourself, like a journalistic concern, or a concern in the profession, about the extent of those relationships, the types of relationships? In your opening statement you talk about cosy relationships.
It depends when you're talking about, Deputy. I guess much like the debate around was it a liquidity or solvency crisis, the focus, I started in the Irish Times and I started reporting day to day on the banks in September 2007. It was all about liquidity at that point. And the focus, my focus in particular, was how exactly are the banks funding themselves? How is this international crisis affecting their funding? In the latter part of 2007, early part of 2008, do the banks have subprime assets on their books? And that was the real warning sign, that if we saw some of these subprime assets on the books of the banks, they could potentially be in serious trouble. The crisis evolved, as we know, became more about domestic deposits through midpoint in 2008, and then, as we know, with September 2008. So the concern about the relationships that I speak about in the opening statement didn't really figure in my coverage at that point, because the focus was very much liquidity. But then certainly the questions started being asked, as I mentioned before, the report in May 2008, where the level of interest roll up, which is a sign of distress. I mean, borrowers can't pay their interest, so it rolls up. That's a risk to the banks. And then, kind of in the middle of 2008, we started kind of wondering, well, how exactly are these banks being affected? And then the liquidity crisis reached a peak with the guarantee, and thereafter then, in the following 2 years, right up to the present, it's about solvency and just the quality of the loans in these institutions.
At the time of the guarantee, in that kind of crisis period, were you concerned with the pace of decision making about how certain relationships might have been affecting how decisions were taken?
Well, the first part of that, I was certainly concerned. Concern is the wrong word to use. I was surprised at the pace that the crisis was developing, how quickly it happened. I didn't necessarily jump to what access do people have at this time. Like, we were following it. It was a day-to-day crisis. It was panic stations for a lot of these financial institutions in the second half of 2008. We now know that the Anglo was losing $500 million a day, up to $1 billion a day, and the money was draining out of the bank. And there were daily meetings, and there were, in fact, within the banks was daily reporting of just how bad it is to the central bank and the financial regulator.
Did you notice any change in relationships between key actors that you spoke to as the crisis erupted and post the guarantee?
Certainly I saw much greater interaction between the central bank, the regulatory authorities and the banks. There was almost daily meetings. I don't know if they met every single day, but there was almost.
This is in the period building up to and after the guarantee?
Yeah, but specifically up to the guarantee. And there was a little bit less. As the guarantee came in and you could see the effect of the money coming back into the banks, that crisis would have declined.
Were you aware of any blame game erupting in between principal actors at the time?
Yeah, there was. Blame gaming maybe is one way. I don't know if I'd agree with that term or that phrase. I think there was a sense is like we're not as weak as that institution, or that institution is much weaker than us. And again, the concern at the time of that week was that with this blanket guarantee, it wasn't differentiating between the weakest and the strongest. Even though we now know that most of the institutions now, given what they had on their loan books, but which hadn't come through at that stage, we knew that a lot of them were in dire straits, certainly from a liquidity point of view, but there were solvency issues around some of the banks. But the market had not fallen yet to the extent that it later did to expose those solvency issues.
So Thank you. So the banks were briefing against each other as to...
I won't say they were briefing against each other.
Sorry.
It was more... There was certainly... well, particularly on the night of the guarantee, as I understand it, there was a lot of a fear of being lumped in with Anglo-Irish Bank and Irish Nationwide and the other banks wanting it to be known, certainly, that we're not as bad as they are. You know.
And what about your understanding of the relationship between the coalition partners in government at the time?
I think there were. How do you mean exactly?
Well, were you keeping up contacts with senior sources in either of the government partners?
My memory of that period is that I was trying to talk to absolutely everyone I could in all the different agencies to try and find out what was going on. Like there was a sense of just out and out panic, and when there was people were trying to figure out what was going on. It was, from the point of view of a journalist, it was kind of a fertile time to be reporting on it, because you were able to find out a lot more, because people were across the spectrum. People were speaking to you to find out, well, what have you heard? What have you heard? And so it was this kind of, I suppose, frenzy of trying to find out information about what was going on.
Thank you. Then, as things settled then after that crisis period, did you notice a change between the coalition partners in terms of levels of trust?
I can't really answer that. I don't know. My focus was very much on the financial banking side. The coalition partners, I'd say, were up to speed with each other and what was going on. There's an incorporeal cabinet meeting to agree that the guarantee, as we know, so they were all contacted. But my understanding is that, yes, there was certainly a concerted effort by members of the junior party in the coalition to find out exactly what was going on. And I don't think anyone was kept in the dark, if I could put it like that.
Okay. Thank you.